Purging of Rouen, Abridged, Episode 15. Sedovitz smiled, pitying her attempts at comprehending his genius. "The bowels of this castle are heated pits of hardened lava," he said. "The most perfect cauldron in which to brew." He pointed at the steaming canister above. "And these are simply double-conduited, four-chambered parry baths, fitted with barometric timers in Siskin field couplets." "Four-chambered?" said the Derby. "Don't you have to be terribly careful with asymmetrical turbulence induction?" With a scoff, he said, "The chambers are not quadrants, the Derby. They are centered thirds, with the fourth being an epi-pressured circumferential chamber housing one half the pressure. Its stability renders turbulence induction highly symmetrical." Part of the keep's roof collapsed in a shudder of explosion. The Derby ignored it, her gaze dulled in calculation. "But that's brilliant," she whispered, and moved closer. "Sedovitz, will you show me the consequences of such work?" Oscar groaned. Sedovitz glanced at him again. "Not that there'll be a next time," he said. "But don't try playing the hero again. Instead, leave it to animals as magnificent as me. Animals worthy." He sneered then. "Look on the bright side. At least animals will no longer have to shy from your disgusting appearance." When he moved to unlock the cage, the Derby smiled at Sedovitz and said, "Now might be a rather good time to use a fluff grenade, I shouldn't wonder." Sedovitz turned to her. "Use a what?" Jolted from despondence, Oscar blinked at her, battled to remember whether he had one and where he'd put it. Fiddling with his collapsible tummy, he retrieved the remaining grenade and waved it at her triumphantly. With a flick of his paw, he primed the thing and lobbed it at Sedovitz. The cat spun around and stared at Oscar's tummy. "A collapsible tummy!" he cried. In the 3 seconds remaining, Oscar raised his whiskers and said, "Where's your sharpened tube of wormy ointment now, Sedovitz?" But the cat just gaped at him. "Because you're jolly well going to need it, matey." There was a flash and a bang, and then a veritable world of fluff. The Derby leapt sideways and covered all available orifices, and while Sedovitz hoiked and wheezed, Oscar retrieved the paw cuffs and lashed the cat to the cage. "Knocked out and paw cuffed in one evening," the Derby said. "Looks like Oscar is considerably more worthy after all." But before anything further was said, there was a tremendous explosion from the keep. The air shuddered and stone spat through it as the wall groaned and began to divide in two. With a splitting beneath them, the courtyard shifted and lifted sickeningly. Scaffolding collapsed, catapults growled and slipped from tethers, their ropes screaming at breaking point. And then, like whips slicing air, rigging tore to lash from high points of knot like some tentacled monster gone mad. In the distance, the keep ignited and slid downwards in a thundering plume of smoke. Its boom shifted castle grounds further and ruptured rock from battlements above. Within the cage, the massive knot of rope began to tear and unwind as the shifting catapults bore upon it. In despair, the Derby threw herself at Oscar. Grasping at a rope swinging like a python from the catapult above, Oscar wrapped it around his paw while the other pulled the Derby closer. Amidst the noise of tilting world, Sedovitz glared at them and pulled at the cuffs. "I hope you realize, Duvin," he said, "that this is all part of my ruse," and he hit the cuffs with his free paw. Oscar looked at him as the cage began to twist. "A word of advice, Sedovitz," he said, their world turning sideways and beginning to invert. "You really ought to fail more often, you arrogant animal. It suits you rather well." The wall shattered, anchoring was lost, and 13 catapults slid across the courtyard in a laborious lunge of dance. They buckled, split and groaned, their payloads bursting like rotten fruit and swamping everything beneath in a nightmare of fetid minestrone soup. Above, the massive arm of catapults screamed in release, slamming tight the rope Oscar held. With a pull immeasurable, the cats were launched up and away in a monumental volley of throw. As they rocketed into the sky, the ground beneath burst and splayed, returning the castle back to considerably less than the sum of its parts. Soaring through the air, the dervish screamed into Oscar's fur, and tearing through cold night, he found that yes, his head could indeed play a tune. When their ascent slowed, the wind's roar lessened, although the dervish's screams did not. Suspended, Oscar scrabbled frantically in his collapsible tummy for the bedsheet before latching his paws into its threaded cords. When descent began, he threw the sheet upward, where it whipped and whirled while he struggled with the cord. With a jolt, the sheet snapped open, slowing their descent. The dervish did not stop screaming, however, until Oscar assured her that the worst was probably over. Tentatively, she ceased dousing his fur in warm dribble and removed herself from his coat. Together, they watched the view. Beneath them, the castle of Rouen boiled in cloud. Beyond it, the spicy Cabinari waited in splendid indifference upon a black oil of sea. Upon the coastal road, a strobing line of blue flashing lights crept closer, and in the distance, scried beneath silvered starlight, lay Rouen, sleeping in its cradle of shore, unaware of how close it had come to a most dreadful awakening. "Is it over?" the dervish asked, the cold wind pulling at their whiskers while they clutched each other. Oscar smiled. "So you haven't lost your lisp?" She shook her head. "It was all an act." "And a rather good one, it would seem." "But is it really over?" "Almost," he said. "Almost?" "I'm rather afraid we have to land first." She smiled and clutched him tighter as they sailed across the sky. "Then I am glad you are driving." "Yes," he agreed. "Although there is perhaps one concern I have." She looked at him while he watched a cliff edge approach. "I think I'm about to land," he said, "in precisely the same manner you tend to park." And indeed they did so. Snagged on the side of the cliff then, neither was concerned, for this time not only had they plenty of rope, but an entourage of police cars above. With his coat thick and fluffy, and sporting a fresh pair of pantaloons, Oscar Teabag Duvin waited in the lair of the catacombs upon a nice, comfortable chair. He tucked his tail in beside him, a bit like a seatbelt, which was a necessary restraint considering the excellent news he'd received on arrival. There was a click of door, followed by a soft padding of paw when the loud purr arrived. Oscar stood, remembering to untuck his tail first, as previous occasions of forgetting had made standing unnecessarily complicated. The loud purr frowned, his attention on the catacombs' collated dossier of Oscar's Curiosa. Sitting at his authoritative desk, the large cat remained absorbed in the report. "Pantaloons," he then said sourly, and without looking up. "I see you exercise the utmost discretion by spectacularly destroying the majority of Rouen's unique architectural heritage." Oscar remained silent, quite thrilled. The loud purr waved for him to sit, and he did so, securing himself appropriately. "And according to this, you also appear to have committed several counts of theft, one of vandalism, multiple assaults," he flicked over the page, "as well as damage to properties." He emphasised the plural. "Considerable trespass and one count of unauthorised chicken insertion." But Oscar remained indifferent. Considering the news, such detail hardly mattered. The loud purr glowered at him before passing him a paper from the dossier. Oscar took it. It was an arrest warrant issued by Rouen's police chief listing the aforementioned crimes, with a large, full unrequited pardon stamped across it. This was followed by, "Dear Oscar Teabag Duvin, thank you ever so much for all your help," scrawled beneath and signed by the chief. Oscar smiled. Such accolade only contributed to his thrill. "Isn't it extraordinary, though, your stern pawiness?" Oscar said. "I mean, what are the chances of such fortune?" The large cat glowered then at the report. "Really," he continued, "all that collapsed castle and fermented manure, not to mention the ghastly green fog, and all those explosions and smoke and imploding mountain and probably molten lava beneath. and he stared at the loud purr in disbelief. And yet not one animal trapped within perished. The loud purr nodded as he flicked through the dossier. So it would seem. Quite extraordinary, Oscar said. One would surely think such outcomes are reserved for ridiculous works of fiction rather than anything resembling real life. The loud purr humphed while flicking through further pages. And Horace Humpelhenke? Oscar asked. In Rouen's hospital, the loud purr read, evidently treating himself for bruises. He turned over the page. Before treating the other 157 animals trapped similarly. He looked up with a confused frown, adding, with considerable help from his wife, apparently. Oscar smiled. And Sedovitz Tarpanu? The large cat perused the document again. Although there is mention of a Sedovitz, he said, it's only in relation to him not being found. Oscar frowned then. If there was to be a casualty, that animal was perhaps most deserving, although he felt a peculiar tug of regret at the thought. And the Pyjami? Upon his mention of her, the loud purr pummeled him with a glare, leaving Oscar to feel as though he'd trodden in something nasty that was unlikely to be removed with a discreet wipe. The large cat sank then, his gaze withering into reflection. The Pyjami, he said, is now in a maximum security nursing home in Milos, along with the majority of the ruling council, in fact. He looked at Oscar carefully. What was your impression of the Pyjami pantaloons? Oscar sensed he ought to tread very carefully. Well, clearly she is quite mad, your excessive fluffiness. She's also spectacularly bitter, extraordinarily rude, and smells quite a lot like mothballs. The loud purr nodded, and his gaze fell away. She was once very different, Pantaloons. Determined and idealistic perhaps, but steadfastly loyal nonetheless. You knew her? Oscar whispered, astonished. Yes, for quite some time I did, although it was a long time ago. He stood then and went to his tall window, which he peered through for a time. Animals change, Pantaloons, it is true of all of us, but I fear that bitterness, once sown, never dies. Bitterness is perhaps its own nourishment. Unable to imagine the loud purr knew a creature as twisted as she, Oscar just stared. Nor had he seen the cat so despondent. He leant forward. Perhaps, in the end, your extensible tailiness, such bitterness consumes only itself. The loud purr nodded gravely. So it would seem. With a sigh, he added, You understand now why I was ambiguous, that this curiosa was personal. Oscar did indeed. Had he been aware of their acquaintance, confusion over loyalty might have ended in disaster for Rouen. Your intuition, Pantaloons, has served you well, for I did not know which of the two animals was more to blame. The two animals? Oscar asked, having been under the impression the loud purr had not heard of Sedovitz. Yes, Pantaloons. Family can be terribly complicated sometimes. Family? Indeed, those two animals are as bad as each other. Tell me, Pantaloons, what was your impression of the Derby? Again, Oscar stared, and then blinked in a veritable swathe of the things. He cleared his throat and glanced around for a bucket. Well, he began, swallowing instead. The Derby is quite a different animal altogether, your overtly deafeningness. She is clever and resourceful. She's determined and idealistic and steadfastly loyal and... But he stopped when realizing his words echoed the loud purr's description of the Pyjami, the corollary of which left him flabbergasted. I thank you for averting such horror, the loud purr said, in a return to both his usual gruffness and his desk. In truth, I had no idea things had become so precarious, and knew only that one day the two animals would come to quarrel. He sat, and after a pause added, You have done splendidly, Pantaloons. Your intuition has served you well, and I appreciate your discretion, despite your destroying almost everything. Well, I must say, were it not for the Derby, and indeed Horace, I fear I would have got nowhere. It was fortune and chance alone that permitted reprieve, rather than any skill or ability on my part. The loud purr looked at him with a withering glare. And what's more, he continued, oblivious to it, the Dervy and I cut it remarkably fine. In the end, I could have done little to avert disaster. The collapsing castle saved Rouen, rather than me. Noticing the cat's glare, Oscar stopped. Worried, he appeared to seek further praise. The loud purr leant forward to offer words echoing those Oscar had heard beneath the black cliffs. Some velvet paws may require fire and brimstone pantaloons, but others are of a calibre requiring no such bolstering. You, more than you can ever know, are a velvet paw of Asquith most deserving. They were interrupted then by a knock at the door, and a cat entered with an envelope. Apologising for the intrusion, he said, This arrived merely moments ago, Loud Purr. And crossing the lair, he offered Oscar a small padded envelope. It was from Hotel de Rouen. He opened it. Inside was a key with a label that had the number 7 crossed out and Oscar's room scribbled beneath. There was also a note attached that read, For whenever you are passing through, which was signed Percival S. Minton. Additionally, there was a piece of paper in a familiar paw scrawl. Oscar smiled. It seemed, despite her role as Rouen's new head counsellor, the Dervy had already found time to help Percival organise his hotel after all, just as she'd promised Oscar. He read her writing with a lisp. It was a poem. I have a friend, of whom I met, from far across the sea, a noble cat and clever poet, who twice did rescue me. He the velvet paw of Asquith, being a title quite deserving, and if he doubts his worth as such, he need think only of the Dervies. And although he's softly spoken and jolly good with words, he has a heart as beautiful as his abundant fluffy furs. And yes, it's true he's earless, but on this one needn't dwell, for if an F is put before it, he is truly that as well. Deeply touched, Oscar dared not look up, lest the loud purr noticed. Folding the poem, he cleared his throat politely and wished he had some ears to twitch beneath the loud purr's gaze. But having none, he stared instead at the folded paper. Curious then, he unfolded it and raised it gingerly to his nose, relieved she'd used ink rather than her more traditional choice of media. He placed the poem carefully back in the envelope. He'd get it framed perhaps, and put it on his mantelpiece. It seemed some poems ought to be written down, after all.